Okay, I think I can see the numbers slowing down, so let's go ahead and get started. But to anyone who's joined in just the last couple of moments, welcome, welcome. I'll start by introducing myself. So my name is Rain Sherlock. I'm the head of evaluation at TASO, and I'm going to be talking you through evaluation support for attainment raising today. I've just mentioned that we're using the webinar function on Zoom, so you won't be able to hear each other or see each other. Your cameras are off, your mics are muted, but you can use the Q&A function on Zoom, so you can submit your questions by just typing them into that chat box as they come to you throughout the session, and then we'll answer them towards the end. So let's jump straight in, because we do have quite a lot of content to get through in an hour this morning. So just to start with a kind of brief overview or outline of what we're going to cover today. In a moment, I'll give you an introduction to this evaluation series overall, and talk you through what that's going to look like over the next couple of weeks. And then today we'll focus on theory of change. So there'll be a sort of brief overview and introduction to theory of change, and then we'll spend most of our time developing or going through an example of how to develop a theory of change relevant to attainment raising initiatives. As I've already mentioned, we do have a Q&A function, and we'll leave some time for questions at the end of the session today. So do feel free to just drop your questions into the typed written Q&A box throughout the session. So to get started, an introduction to this evaluation support series and what we're planning to talk to you about and cover over the next 3 sessions. I guess the place to start is to think back to February 2022, when the Office for Students called for universities and higher education providers to do more to raise the academic attainment of school-aged pupils, and to deliver this through widening participation activities. So since then, and also prior to that renewed focus on attainment raising, many higher education providers in the UK and kind of other sector organisations have been working to deliver interventions that aim at reducing the attainment gaps that we observe in the existing data. So these are interventions like tutoring, we've got teacher training and CPD activities increasingly coming through, placing HEP staff on kind of school governance boards or placing them in schools, and a range of other activities that are being co-designed and developed by higher education providers to deliver with schools and for pupils for whom attainment is a barrier to accessing higher education. So we've seen quite a lot of kind of noise and movement in this space over the last 12 months or so. And this evaluation series is designed to help provide a sort of container or some kind of strategic direction for how higher education providers can evaluate these activities as they deliver them, or you may already be delivering these activities, and how you can think through the evaluation of those activities. But why the focus on attainment and kind of where to start? So some of you may know, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the fact that existing evidence, or the evidence that we currently have in the sector, shows that attainment, or academic achievement as it sometimes is referred to, is a really important predictor of progression to higher education. So what you can see on screen here is that we have a bunch of students or pupils, and that attainment becomes a really important element of whether or not those students or pupils are likely to enter higher education. But we also know that there are lots of other factors, including kind of characteristics and demographic information, that influences whether or not a student is likely to attend higher education. So these are things like family background, whether or not the student receives free school meals, but also characteristics like gender, ethnicity. And these in some way impact the likelihood of a student entering higher education and then going on to complete higher education, and the various labour market outcomes that might be achieved post higher education, so once a student leaves. However, we also see, when we observe the existing data, that if we control for attainment, we see the existing large gaps between pupils entering higher education somewhat reduced. So in other words, what we're observing is that academic attainment becomes a key predictor of whether or not a student enters higher education. So not just things like free school meal status, gender, ethnicity, but actually once we input and control for attainment, those gaps reduce slightly. Yet, we do also observe quite persistent gaps in attainment, and particularly at GCSE level. So to give you an example, in the academic year of 2020-2021, we saw that 30% of students eligible for free school meals achieved a grade 5 or above in their GCSE, and that this compares to 57% of students who were not in receipt of free school meals. So that's quite a large gap, and it's linked to, kind of hinges on the academic attainment at Key Stage 5. Now, if we can increase attainment at Key Stage 5 and support students to be achieving higher in terms of their academic studies, it's likely that we'll have quite a significant impact on reducing the gap in terms of those who do actually end up entering or attending higher education. So basically, interventions that focus on raising attainment become really important. And with that, of course, the evaluation of these interventions so that we can work out the most effective strategy for supporting students to attain and to eventually enter higher education, and ultimately to reduce equality gaps for these different groups of students. But where do we start? We have a lot of types of interventions that we're interested in, or sometimes just referred to as kind of activities, or even programs that are made up of multiple activities. So tutoring, school governance, teacher CPD, revision workshops, homework support, and there are many others. And we also have quite a large array of outcomes that we're interested in. Some short-term, some long-term, so things like literacy skills, cognitive strategies, access to higher education is a longer-term outcome, attainment itself, so grades in English, math, or other subjects, things like self-efficacy, sense of belonging, confidence can all impact whether or not a student is able to attain higher and therefore have a better chance of entering higher education in the long term. There's quite a lot of factors to think about here, and it can be difficult to know what to focus on. And linked to this, there's a kind of tension, I guess, between how we have maximum impact while working with limited resources. So in an ideal world, practitioners or evaluators, higher education providers generally would have an unlimited amount of resources. We'd have time, money, human resources to be able to implement every intervention that we think could have an impact for students. But as I'm sure you know even better than I do, ultimately and unfortunately this isn't the case, and we do need to make quite careful and strategic decisions regarding where to allocate resources and which activities to focus on. Beyond that, we also want to know how to design programs as effectively as possible, so not just which ones to select and decide to deliver, but how do we actually bake evidence and evaluation into the design of interventions so that we are delivering the things that we think are going to be most impactful and work best to achieve outcomes for students. So in a nutshell, this is why evaluation is so important, so that we know we're delivering the interventions that can have the best impact. And it's also really the motivation for us delivering this kind of 3-part series on how to evaluate attainment-raising activities or interventions. So I'm sure as you signed up for this webinar, you will have seen that we are conducting 3 online webinars just like this one today between now and the winter break. The first webinar will focus on theory of change, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And then the second webinar will focus on taking that theory of change and thinking about how to develop research questions and select appropriate outcome measures to measure the impact of our theory of change. And then also, finally, the third session, we'll talk about choosing an evaluation methodology. So we'll talk through some of the different evaluation designs and approaches that can be used to ultimately evaluate the impact of your theory of change and the impact that your intervention is having or could have for students. But to take it in bite-sized chunks, we will focus on theory of change for today. And I want to start by situating us within this kind of evaluation cycle, which I think is probably becoming increasingly familiar to many of you. What this shows is a 4-step process that we call at TASO our monitoring and evaluation framework, or MEF, MEF for short, as you may have seen the abbreviation. And it takes you through a kind of circular design of the 4 phases. So phase 1 is diagnose, that's where we're situated today, and it focuses mainly on theory of change. Phase 2, plan, is where we start to design research questions, select outcome measures, think through the appropriate tools and guidance that we can use to set up and develop our evaluation. Phase 3 then is measure. So once we know which tools we're using, once we know what our kind of high-level strategic theory of change is, how do we collect data to measure impact against that? And then phase 4, leading on kind of rather intuitively, is to reflect. So we would analyze that data, write it up into a report, and think about what we've observed in terms of students' progress and outcomes across the life cycle of the intervention. The circular motion of this diagram is communicating that it's kind of a never-ending process. Once you've been through each of these 4 phases once, you can take your reflections, your learnings from phase 4 and feed them back into your theory of change and kind of iterate and update that. And then we start the process again as we continue to deliver our activities and interventions. So really, we're trying to embed evaluation at every phase of the delivery of an intervention and learning from that intervention to improve practice going forwards. So thinking about phase 1, diagnose, what is a theory of change? In simple terms, although I appreciate it's not really that simple, a theory of change is your theory for predicting how the intervention or activity that you're hoping to deliver or may already be delivering will bring about change for students. So the desired kind of journey of outcomes or change that we want those students to achieve in order to be able to reach their long-term goals. A theory of change is typically a visual tool, so it's often a diagram or a kind of simple set of logic and columns that outline the student journey through the intervention. So, for example, it's how does a tutoring program lead to increased attainment for underrepresented groups, and what are all the kind of stepping stone elements and components that are needed for that change to be achieved? You're setting out exactly what you think, how you think this will work. So each of the individual elements that make up a whole program, or even each of the individual elements that make up just one intervention. So not necessarily a kind of multi-intervention program. And what will the intermediate and long-term changes be that help a student achieve that ultimate goal? So there's a few things to consider and think about when we sit down to start developing our theories of change. And the first is that it requires you to outline the outcomes before you actually settle on or design the specific activities and interventions that you're going to focus on. So this allows you to design interventions which can actually achieve the desired outcomes, and we can track back to make sure that we're using evidence at each point in that journey. It also allows you to critically look at the activities or interventions and make sure that you're being very transparent about how you think this will lead to long-term change or a long-term goal. So it's theorizing. It's really in the title of theory of change, but it's using as much evidence and logic as we can to build up that theory and to conduct the kind of desk-based theorizing that's required up front before we even start delivering the intervention. And a theory of change model will also help you identify the different indicators of success that you need to measure in order to understand whether your theorizing or assumptions hold true and actually work for students as you get started with delivering the intervention. So what we're going to spend the next little bit of time doing is a kind of step-by-step walkthrough of how we could develop a theory of change for just one intervention type. And of course, as we saw on that little signpost slide a moment ago, there are so many different types of activities or interventions that we might want to deliver. But for ease, we're going to take just one and take you through each step or component of a theory of change. Before we do that, let's look at the core theory of change template in its totality. So this, again, diagram slide might be familiar to some of you. It's what we call at TASO our kind of core or most high-level simple diagram theory of change. And as you can see, there are multiple different boxes or columns, and each of them numbered to help you think through the kind of sequential steps to developing a theory of change. So just briefly, we start with section 1, situation. What's the kind of high-level context that we're existing in or trying to tackle? Step 2 then is aims. So thinking about that kind of environmental contextual factors that outline our situation. What are the more specific 1, 2, or 3 high-level aims or objectives that we want to achieve. And then coming to impact. So on the right-hand side of the diagram, what's the long-term goal that we hope this theory of change or this program or intervention will help students achieve? In our context as students, of course, it could be kind of any user group. If you're working with teachers or even with parents to support attainment or guardians, it may be that your long-term impact is not specific to students, but to a wider ecosystem of kind of key players in this space as well. Moving from impact, then we come to outcomes. So what are the individual elements of change that we're interested in for our users? So typically students, but also parents and guardians, teachers, etc. And then skipping to activities. In order to achieve the outcomes, what are the activities that we need to deliver? So it might be tutoring programs, it might be teacher CPD, and we would kind of break it down into more granular, smaller elements of the different activities or interventions that we want to include in our overall theory of change. We then come back to the middle column and think about outputs. So what are the results or key deliverables that will happen as a result of our activities? And then to inputs, what do we need, what's required, what do we need to be able to deliver this intervention? It can be quite practical. So financial input, it could be delivery space, so a room, a venue, facilities, and it's also the people. Who are we kind of teachers, student ambassadors, peers? What are all the different elements or inputs that we need to think about and include? And then finally, rationale and assumptions. What is the theory or logic or existing evidence that underpins, and that is kind of demonstrated on the diagram by it being a sort of foundation to the bottom of the diagram. What are the different evidence, kind of common sense that underpins the overall theory about how this change will take place for our key users? So we will take one by one each of these boxes and think about how to populate it to end up with an overall theory of change. So first, situation and aims. We need to start here by asking ourselves 3 key questions, or 3 questions that can be really useful for narrowing down our situation. So what is the context? What issues is the intervention trying to address? And what objective is the intervention trying to achieve? So for the theory of change example that we're going to use for today, and we'll stick with it for the whole session, I've outlined a kind of high-level situation of deprivation generally, but also the COVID-19 pandemic has exaggerated attainment disparities and led to pupils needing more support in reading and literacy. So the lack of reading skills amongst pupils is often a barrier to progressing to higher education, as pupils are likely to obtain lower in GCSE grades. And as we saw previously, a gap observed at the point of Key Stage 5 or GCSE can impact longer term gaps in terms of who actually accesses higher education. So thinking about aims then, we've got 2 main aims for this theory of change. One is to raise attainment levels across Key Stage 3 in selected schools and bolster students' confidence in their academic abilities. And number 2 is to introduce students to higher education, which will hopefully provide them with valuable insights about what it might be like to be in a higher educational setting and the different pathways that they could take to get there. So this is just our overall context. We've got a number of factors that have caused literacy and reading levels to be lower at the moment. And our kind of main aims are that we want to raise attainment and then raise those literacy levels, and also introduce students to higher education so that they have a rough idea of higher education being an option for them and what that might look or feel like if they were to apply and want to go to higher education later in their educational journey. Once we've got our situation and aims in place, we then come to think about impact, or that long-term goal. So what do we want the intervention to help us achieve in the kind of long term? And there are, again, kind of 3 key questions that can help us think this through. So what's the desired effect of the intervention? What are the success criteria for the intervention? And what's the overall change that we're trying to achieve for students? Again, I'll then come back to my theory of change diagram and try and articulate in quite simple terms the main things that I want this intervention to achieve in the sort of longer term. So This is very closely connected to our aims, and what I've put here for the intervention that we're discussing is improved attainment in literacy and English at Key Stage 3, and that's a key stepping stone to Key Stage 4, Key Stage 5, and so on and so forth, and then also an increased likelihood to progress to higher education. Now, of course, in the context of us working with Key Stage 3 students, the likelihood of progressing to higher education is quite far in the distance, but it's still really important for us to have that kind of overall long-term milestone that we're looking towards as we track back and think about each of the elements that we need to put in place in order to help students get there. So in other words, the intervention, if we were to remove the barrier of reading skills preventing students from entering higher education, and we were to kind of imagine a world in which that didn't exist, then we would be able to have better literacy skills, improved English at Key Stage 3, and ultimately students more likely to enter higher education. We then come to the next kind of column or section that we need to think about, and this is outcomes. So put simply, an outcome is the change or the result that the intervention is trying to create. And outcomes can be split in a number of ways. So we can either split them temporally, so we can think about short-term outcomes, intermediate-term outcomes, and long-term outcomes. But we can also think about outcomes as being either behavioral, so things like attainment, or non-behavioral. So these are things like attitudes towards HE, but also academic self-efficacy, sense of belonging, typically things that are measured through kind of qualitative data or survey scales, as opposed to just observing student behaviour. And we have developed a tool at TASO to help us think through the different types of outcomes that we might be interested in when trying to improve student attainment overall. So we call this tool the Mapping of Outcomes and Activities tool, or MOAT as the abbreviation. And the slide that I've got here is just a visual representation or kind of overview of the MOAT, the Mapping of Outcomes and Activities tool. So at the top, you've got a activity type of skills and attainment, and we then have that broken down into a series of activity subtypes. So these are things we've already mentioned, like homework support, teacher CPD, literacy sessions, tutoring, and they're all the different elements or specific activities that make up the skills and attainment activity type. If you look further down the diagram then at these various colourful boxes, we have coded different outcomes into behavioural and non-behavioural. So the green outcomes as they appear on my screen are behavioural. So these are things like attainment, engagement with school, or engagement with different lessons. But also then non-behavioural outcomes. So things like academic self-efficacy, sense of belonging, cognitive strategies. Coming further down the diagram again, we've got long-term outcomes. So these are things like attainment itself at Key Stage 3, 4, and 5, but also longer term than that, in likelihood to engage in or enter higher education. And then longer than that, again, it's progression and retention once they're at higher education, and ultimately completion of a higher education qualification. And then finally, at the very bottom of this diagram, we've got a series of data indicators that would help us understand whether or not we're achieving these outcomes. So these are things like attainment data, which you may get from HEAT or MREP or Aim Higher, or the National Pupil Database, UCAS data, etc. But what are the different kind of sources of information that would help us measure our theory of change and attainment overall? So this tool is to basically help us populate and think about the outcome section of a theory of change. And as well as this visual diagram, we have a practical spreadsheet that you can access on the TASO website. And this displays a series of tabs. So you'll see along the bottom here, we've got subtypes of activities, we've got outcome bins, mapping, and outcome definitions. And we're going to go through each of these in the next couple of minutes. But just to start with outcome definitions, this is a useful tab to help you look at each of the list of definitions, each of the list of outcomes, and then read about the definition for that outcome and understand if it's exactly what you are trying to get at, or the kind of specific change that you're trying to initiate or implement for students. So For example, we can take reading skills, I think we've got, and then you can see a definition for reading skills. So it's defined as the student's ability to comprehend, interpret, and analyze the written text. Once you've understood the definitions of the outcomes, we can then look at the outcomes bin tab of this spreadsheet, which is the kind of overall mode spreadsheet. And you can see here that these outcomes are split into short, intermediate, and long term. So we've got kind of across the top there, the different temporal elements of the outcomes, but they're also split into behavioral and non-behavioral outcomes. So thinking about the theory of change we've been developing so far, I need to select outcomes that will help us achieve the long-term impact. So we had long-term impact of improved attainment and literacy skills at key stage 3, and then increased likelihood to progress to higher education. And I now want to look at this tab and select all the different outcomes that I think will help me achieve that long-term goal. So, for example, I could select increased student engagement with their studies. So if a student is more likely to participate in the learning process by engaging and attending their classes, ultimately they're more likely to have a better understanding of literacy and English, and hopefully that contributes longer term to attainment and likely to progress to higher education. But we can also have outcomes like increased subject knowledge. In this example, we're particularly interested in English, but of course, it may be a different focus or intervention. It might be math or STEM or any other subject. Also, improved reading skills as being really critical to the long-term goal of literacy. Increased academic self-efficacy. So self-efficacy helps a student believe in their own ability and confidence to achieve their goals and what they're hoping to get to on their path to attending higher education. And then, of course, ultimately increase key stage 3 attainment. We're also interested in this example in sense of belonging, because a student feeling like they have a kind of sense of identity and that they think higher education is a place for them and that they fit in is a really important contributing factor to whether or not they're likely to continue to engage with their studies and continue to build academic self-efficacy. So you can see that each of these outcomes begin to kind of interact and interplay with each other as well. So I then come back to my theory of change diagram, and I can begin to plot the outcomes box or column. So each of the outcomes that we saw on the previous slide, so here, we've just lifted the highlighted ones and added them to our outcomes column here. And as you'll see, we now have a combination of intermediate and long-term outcomes, but also behavioral and non-behavioral outcomes. So it's a real mix. Next, we need to come to think about activities. So activities are really the different elements of an intervention, or indeed a kind of larger program, that are delivered by practitioners or delivery staff. And there are a couple of questions that we can ask ourselves at the point of considering which activities we want to focus on. So what are the specific elements which make up our intervention of program overall? And what are the activities that need to be present to result in the outputs and hopefully the longer term desired outcomes for students? Now, ideally, we work backwards from outcomes and add the detail of the activities or the different elements of a program which make up the intervention overall. And thinking about the attainment-raising moat, the mapping of outcomes and activities tool, we also have a tab that can help us do this. So looking at tab 3 of this spreadsheet, the mapping tab, what this does is link different outcome types and different activity types. And these linkings are based on existing literature or evidence, so what we have observed by reviewing and reading all of the different interventions and evaluations that have currently taken place, and not just in the UK, but sometimes from outside the UK. But they're also linked based on existing practice. So we've spoken to many higher education providers and conducted a consultation. And what we see on this tab is the links between the activities that are delivered and the desired outcomes that those activities should achieve for students. So looking at this, what we want to do to populate the next section of our theory of change is, first of all, to re-identify the relevant outcomes that we hope to achieve for students. And what we can see here is spot improved reading skills, which we had in our outcomes bucket. And we can see that that is linked back to or tracked back to literacy sessions as the activity or the element of the programme that we're hoping to deliver. We can also spot the outcomes of increased subject knowledge. In our case, we're specifically interested in English because of the overall context that our theory of change is operating in, and also increased academic self-efficacy and the links to subject-specific tutoring. So this would be subject-specific tutoring in English and literacy for us. And so we then take literacy sessions and subject-specific tutoring as two key activities or activity subtypes, and we use that to populate the activity section of our theory of change. So in the activity section of the theory of change, we then flesh out the detail a little bit more. So we don't simply input literacy sessions or subject-specific tutoring, but we kind of contextualize that into the local environment in which we're operating or delivering this program. Of course, this exact example is hypothetical, but you can imagine translating this to your own local context. And what would that look like in very practical terms? How would we deliver literacy sessions or subject-specific tutoring? So what I have said here is that I would like to hold 12 small group tutoring sessions on literacy and reading specifically. I'm imagining delivering those 12 sessions in 1 hour slots. And I do have a kind of rationale and assumption for that we'll come to in a moment, but it's broadly to do with the fact that I think small groups will help students learn more effectively and build relationships with their tutor, and that 1 hour session seems like a reasonable amount of time for students to be able to engage and stay focused and feel motivated, but that much longer in it we might see a kind of drop off in the energy that a student has to kind of sit in a tutoring class. I've also then said that these sessions are going to be delivered by student ambassadors. So if I'm working in a higher education provider, we might have student ambassadors doing an undergraduate degree or even a postgraduate degree who are able to help us go into schools and deliver sessions on improving reading and literacy and improving general understanding of English as a kind of core GCSE subject. Now, if we go back to reviewing our outcomes box or column, you can see the specific outcomes we're interested in. So highlighted in black bold, as it shows on my screen, are the most relevant activities as we saw them linked in the moat on the previous slide. So increased subject knowledge, improved reading skills, and increased academic self-efficacy, it's a tongue twister, were all specifically linked to literacy sessions and subject-specific tutoring. And as you'll remember, these links were based on existing evidence and also existing practice. However, we are still interested in all the other outcomes that we identified. So we've still got things like increased engagement with academic studies. Engagement with studies becomes a really key kind of proxy measure for us. If a student's engaged, they're likely to improve their reading. So that's important. We still want to keep that there. And of course, things like key stage 3 attainment. It might not be the most closely linked outcome to a tutoring session or a literacy session, but it is still our long-term outcome, and we still have that included in our outcome box. Ultimately, we're trying to improve kind of end of term or end of year attainment. So we do want to have that as something that we'll measure using data further down the line after the delivery of our intervention. So looking at this diagram, we're now at a point where we've got the long-term impact, we've got the outcomes, short, intermediate, we've also got behavioural and non-behavioural outcomes in there, and then we've started to think about the very specific elements or components of our activities and intervention that will help us achieve those outcomes. Oh, skipped ahead there. Now what we want to look at is the outputs. So we come to the next box, labelled as box 6, and think about what the outputs for this intervention or theory of change might be. So outputs are the direct results or deliverables of our activities relevant to achieving our longer term outcomes. And outputs should typically be tangible. So we use phrases like exposure to or interaction with or experience of. They're concrete things that we know will happen, and we can't assume they will happen. So we can't assume that you will understand how to use the theory of change and go away and apply it in your own context after this 1-hour webinar. But what we can confidently say is that you have joined and listened to or been exposed to a 1-hour webinar on a theory of change. And it's that exposure to the webinar that's the output. The outcome would be that you understand it and can go away and use it in your own context. So there is a subtle yet really important difference between output and outcome. I am going to talk a little bit more about outputs to make sure that that distinction is kind of clear and hopefully understood before we go ahead and populate the next box of our theory of change. And so I guess the key consideration here is that sometimes in the literature and also in practice, you'll see outputs and outcomes used interchangeably. But what I just want to demonstrate is that there is a difference, and that we need to be quite careful when thinking about that difference in our own context when developing our own theories of change. So we often end up talking about baking and cake at this point. I kind of submit to the quite useful and hopefully fun example of cake to make it seem a bit more relatable and also just a bit simpler to understand. So let's imagine for a moment that it is my colleague's birthday, and that what my colleague wants more than anything for her birthday is a really delicious chocolatey chocolate cake. And let's also imagine, although this is the reality, that it's beyond my baking skills to be able to make that chocolate cake myself and bring it into the office and say happy birthday to my colleague. So we need to think about outputs and outcomes in this overall kind of broad scenario and aims. And most people would say that the outcome here is for me to produce the chocolatey chocolate cake for my colleague. But actually, that's not quite correct. So the output would be the chocolatey chocolate cake, and the outcome would be a really happy colleague in the office who is delighted that her birthday is being celebrated and that she can have the chocolate cake that she really wanted. If I had produced a strawberry cake or a vanilla cake or some other form of cake that wasn't exactly what my colleague had kind of wished for and hoped for, then it's very possible that although the cake would have been produced, the outcome, a kind of happy, celebrated colleague, wouldn't quite be the same, because it wouldn't be exactly what she had in mind, and maybe she doesn't like strawberry or vanilla. So outputs are the direct deliverables from your activity. So these are things that we know will happen rather than that we think could happen. So coming back to a kind of more sensible example of the tutoring program that we're thinking about, the outputs for this theory of change would be that students are exposed to a 12-hour tutoring session, and that students have the opportunity to read a number of books. So I've said 5 books in a 12-week kind of tutoring session. So you can see here the subtle difference between 12 tutoring sessions. So we have 12 tutoring sessions. We deliver them for 1 hour each with the support of student ambassadors. And then you can see the difference between the output, which is that students would be exposed to those tutoring sessions and that they'll have the opportunity to read books, versus the outcomes, which is what we hope will happen, but that we can't be certain will happen. So increased engagement, increased literacy skills, increased subject knowledge, etc. So what we have now is our long-term impact, our outcomes, the activities that we're delivering, and the very specific outputs that we know will happen as a result of those activities. And what we need to think about next is all the different inputs, so resources that we need to put into this intervention to ensure that we're able to effectively deliver it. So inputs are both tangible and intangible. So for example, budget, staff, venue are all tangible inputs, but also important to think about the intangible. So it may be, or I increasingly hear things like senior leadership buy-in is actually a really important input, but a harder thing to kind of tangibly know that we've achieved. But also the knowledge of the people delivering the activity, sometimes even the reputation of the higher education provider or of the people delivering the activity. So quite difficult to tie down the intangible, but equally as important, I think, as tying down the tangible. So yeah, venue, finances, human capital, etc. So we then come back and we add the input section of our theory of change diagram, and you can see here I've just slotted in all the elements that I think are important to delivering this tutoring program. So we need venues and rooms for the tutoring sessions. We need age-appropriate reading materials, books. We need funding. We could add staff time, willing student ambassadors who are skilled and able to deliver tutoring sessions. Finally, then, we need to come to the bottom foundation element of our theory of change, rationale and assumptions. So assumptions and rationale is thinking about what underpins the theory of change model. And they're sometimes implicit, so there are our own underlying beliefs about how we think the program will work. And when I say our own, it could be the evaluators, but it could also be the student ambassadors, the people delivering the tutoring sessions. So based on some combination of previous experience, what we think has worked in the past, sometimes it's just common sense. What do we intuitively think will work? But also existing evidence and existing practice. So if we look at the literacy from the UK, but also further afield, what do we spot as being the key things that need to be present for our intervention to have the desired kind of theorized change that we're hoping it will? It can be really difficult to identify assumptions or kind of change mechanisms at first. And so one tactic that we often use, or certainly that I often use, is to think, what absolutely has to be true for this activity to lead to the longer term outcomes and impact that we're hoping to achieve? So for an example, to use an example relevant to what we're talking about today in terms of tutoring sessions and literacy skills and key stage 3 attainment, it might be that one assumption is that students actually understand the reading material that's being presented to them, and that they're able to then use that knowledge and apply it in their own lessons once they go back into a regular kind of school setting. Sounds really obvious, and often I think assumptions do feel like quite common sense, obvious statements. But if we had mispitched the reading material and they didn't understand, that could have a kind of negative effect in that they feel more overwhelmed than they did before they entered the tutoring program or entered that tutoring session on a specific day. So just thinking through the conditions that absolutely need to be present and occur in order for our stepping stone outcomes to lead to our impact overall. So if I come back to our theory of change diagram, I've got a couple of assumptions that I've included for our example today. So one, as I mentioned, students understand and can digest the information provided during the tutoring sessions, but also that school staff identify, or I should say correctly identify, eligible pupils, so pupils that we think will benefit from this type of support and tutoring. And another one could be, for instance, that students build good relationships with the tutor, so in our case with the student ambassadors, and that actually that kind of familiarity and relationship that builds over the 12 weeks becomes a kind of critical assumption or ingredient for creating the change that we're hoping to achieve longer term and overall. So we add each of these to the bottom of the theory of change diagram. And really, this completes the kind of high-level bird's eye view of the change journey that we expect to occur throughout this 12-week tutoring session. So we've, started with situation and aims, the high-level context, the problem we want to solve, and then we've unpicked that problem into a series of steps that we hope will be able to that students will be able to engage with and will be suitable and relevant to the students that we're engaging with to help them achieve the long-term impact or goal overall. Now, we have intentionally used quite a straightforward example of tutoring, and in the hope that it's simple to understand. However, of course, there are many different types of activities and interventions that you might be considering as you deliver interventions to help improve attainment of students. You may already be delivering these, you may be in the process of planning to deliver these next term or even next academic year. So there's a number of resources that can help you do this in your own time and in your own work and with colleagues. And we have looked at quite a few of these today. So the first is the monitoring and evaluation framework, and of course, phase 1, which is where we have focused today. The next is next is examples of theories of change. So not just the example that we've kind of built in this session, but we do also have on the TASO website a series of 6 theories of change for different types of attainment raising initiatives. So there's one for tutoring, school governance, one for literacy and confidence, and others. And you can access these all on the TASO website. They're open source and you can kind of download them, and as we did today, look at all the different elements and how those theories of change are built up. And then also the attainment raising moat, the mapping of outcomes and activities tool that we used to help build the theory of change we've just looked at together. Again, this is accessible on the TASO website, not just the visual diagram, but the kind of practical spreadsheet that links outcomes to activities. So you can access and download that. And then finally, we have lots of templates and training materials for theory of change. So you can download from the TASO website something called a theory of change pack. And this includes all the blank templates that you need to be able to develop your own theory of change, but also things like slide decks and kind of webinar structures, so that you could take this back and deliver a similar-ish session in your own environments to the rest of your team, be that other evaluators, also practitioners, delivery staff, because often it takes quite a few people to be in the room to have all the information that we need about assumptions and rationale and activities. Many voices pitch into the development of a theory of change. So this theory of change pack basically just gives you all the different components and templates that you need to be able to do that in your own time. Now, all of these resources will be shared in a follow-up email after today's session. So we'll very clearly link to the different elements of the TASO website where you can download and access all of these. So don't worry too much about kind of scribbling it all down now. We will also share with you a video from today, so this recorded session, and another more non-attainment raising specific video on how to develop a theory of change and each of the different elements of a theory of change that we've talked through. So as we saw at the beginning, this was the first in a 3-part series, and on the next webinar, which is I think the 28th of November, it's a Tuesday, we're going to take the theory of change that we've just developed, and we're going to think about how to develop research questions to help us assess the impact of that theory of change, and then also the different outcome measures or data indicators to help us answer those research questions. If you wanted to be really well prepared, what you could do between now and this next session is have a go at populating your own theory of change for the specific attainment raising activity or intervention that you're delivering, and bring that to the next session. And then as we identify research questions and outcome measures, you can apply it to your own context and do it for the intervention or activity that you're focused on.